Hello adventurers and welcome back to my channel. Today I am so excited to bring you along for an Oklahoma adventure. Now along the way we've gone to a lot of unique places and learned a lot of different interesting facts about history, but today is going to be absolutely epic. We are at Fort Washita here in Oklahoma, just a short distance outside of Durant, and we're going to learn a little bit more about what historically this fort was all about. Buckle up, Buttercup, it's about to be real fun. Let's go get some brain wrinkles by starting out in the Visitor Center. We're starting off right in front of the Visitor Center with the Indian Removal Act, and the idea of Indian removal started with Thomas Jefferson after the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. Jefferson considered the Louisiana Purchase to be a place where the tribes east of the Mississippi could be relocated to, and the encroaching American settlers were also a factor in the removal. Now, there's a lot of things that we've learned throughout history, and this sign kind of brings it all together, but more so. But here we have a map of the Chickasaw Treaty and how that those removal routes would work, and what exactly that would have looked like, and how many people would have been relocating to different areas. So this is a really good place to start this entire process, because as a result of this particular Indian Removal Act, then they decided to start the removal process using forts like these. Now this didn't take place immediately. After they decided that they wanted to remove the Indians from these regions, it didn't happen within that presidency. The start of that began there, but it didn't actually really start to take shape until Andrew Jackson, and that happened way down the line in 1828. In fact, with the passing of the Indian Removal Act in 1830, after all of this groundwork was laid, then things like this started to happen at locations like these. Now there are a series of signs right here at the Visitor Center, like this, the Chaplain's Quarters, which were built in 1842 as officer housing, and then they later were assigned to post the chaplain in 1846. They had 2 principal rooms, 2 shed rooms, and then also a detached kitchen. We are in for a treat today because after we finish up out here, there are a few things inside the museum before we do our walking tour, so this is going to be really great. But let's get a little bit more context through some of these signs first, and then we'll move inside. Here we learn in January 1837, the Chickasaw Nation signed a treaty with the United States, the Choctaw and the Chickasaw, which was known as the Treaty of Dokesville. Now we have talked about the Treaty of Dokesville at another fort here in the Oklahoma area, Fort Towson, and it was for a purchased interest in the land and resources from the Choctaw Nation. But we also learned down here at the bottom that as of July 4th, 1837, the first group of Chickasaw people crossed the Mississippi at Memphis, and with all of their personal belongings and livestock, they were part of the removal effort to bring people in to this region of Oklahoma. We also learned a little bit more about the dragoons here. These are all words that will have context that makes sense a little bit more as we move around the fort itself. The dragoons were a branch of the U.S. military who were trained and equipped to fight on horseback and on foot, and their daily chores for the dragoons consisted of caring for their own horses, cleaning out stables, watering, exercising them, and then also participating in various company exercises that would be involving the infantry. By late 1842, they were intending on having these really nice quarters for these people. However, it did not happen. So they instead had these temporary structures that were put into place to survive the winter, and that was partially because of supply shortages and partially because of the intense conditions. So as a result, they had to get them taken care of, and so we learned that. So as we're moving around the fort today, we're going to see a variety of different kinds of structures, and some of them just have stone foundations. A couple of them have walls that extend very high up, and then there was actually a fire here at one point that damaged one of the buildings. So as we're moving around, we'll get context for each of those through signs like these, which is really great. Right over here, guys, that's a cannon, and as you can see, there's lots of little tables out here. They also do some other interesting things, like Dad said that they do a rendezvous out here, and then also they have some like reenactments and things, and the grounds are expansive. Oh wow, this is cool. This is super neat because you can get a close look at this, but also they have the tools that they would use, which leads Dad and I to believe that they may be doing some kind of reenactment very, very soon, because normally these things are not left out, and this has fresh dirt from moving it in. Something like this would have been the big artillery, and what they would do is they would strategically place it at an angle and put all of the things together, and then it would shoot a cannonball somewhere downfield that they had aimed. Now, this didn't have the modern technology of today where they can type in a sequence and it target it and have some laser focus and then it goes. This had a lot bigger of a margin of error. Next to the cannon area, they have the officers' quarters, and the officers' quarters looks more like a laid foundation. It's not quite as visibly representing a building today. It just looks like stones, and this is how a lot of the forts that you come to are today. A lot of them haven't been able to be preserved. Time has taken their toll. If wood was used, the wood is gone. And so whenever you're looking at this, it looks kind of a little bit disjointed, but that's why the signs matter. The signs tell us the story of the places that we're going and why that they are important and what we are physically looking at, in addition to being able to have some context, sometimes through photos. This is what the officers' quarters would have looked like. And you'll notice that it has the stone only around the fireplaces, which means that this is more of a cabin structure, and it would have a little bit of the stone building up the foundation of the cabin, but the rest of the cabin itself would have been materials that would have gone by the wayside as time weathered them. Context matters, and senior officers and those with families were assigned to private quarters. Families were brought a welcome relief from the drudgery of military life, and a married captain with a family might have to give up quarters to a newly arrived single senior officer. Now, this was a common problem for the officers and the wives, and it was known as ranking out, or when a higher ranking person was newly stationed at the post, and that would make an upheaval of the people having to stay in a section. So that's kind of the context for this, and it makes it very interesting because we also learn that women adjusted to the frequency of the moves and learned how to settle quickly and be ready to leave like that. Dad and I got to this spot over here right behind the quarters, and it's the kitchen, and you'll notice here there is a QR code on the sign, making this a little bit more interactive. So Dad's gonna scan it. Whenever we put in the QR code, it takes you to a map, shows you all of the buildings, and then also the labels of what they are, and then that's about it. So it just tells you a little bit about it, and then you can zoom in and you can see better the layout as a whole. So this is where the kitchen is, and you can see all of these little points. There are so many little stops at this spot. Just down the hill from the Visitor Center and Museum, we have the Spring House. These were typically located at a lower lying space, and they were most of the time fed by some form of running water or something that would allow it to be somewhat like a cellar to stay cooler. And while we're on our way down toward the Spring House, Dad just pulled up the map and said there's 34 total stops here. So that's pretty neat. It's an expansive property. And again, whenever you start to pull in, you see some buildings toward the front of the property that are a little bit more substantial. And then as you come toward the back, you get to see all these foundation pieces. But then as we go past this even, there's more. Now, we've made it down to the Spring House. This is pretty interesting because again, we had to go down this hill right here, which isn't a huge hill by any means, but brings you down to a lower lying area. But even beyond this, it gets even lower as you move toward what looks like a channel that water would pass through. There it is, guys. This is the Spring House area. And as you look toward the back of the property, here you can see it continues to go toward this space. That's a strange tree. Goes all the way and then starts going up. Okay, this is the D.H. Cooper cabin, and we just went into this section, and they have like a kitchen and a fireplace, but they have another section on that side that we can go check out, and then also we can get a little context. So let's go look around. General Douglas Hancock Cooper. Kind and sympathetic by nature, generous to a fault, he was known as an honest man of noble impulses, born and bred a gentleman. And these were words of a contemporary Brigadier General Douglas Cooper. Cooper was appointed as a U.S. agent of the Choctaws in 1853 and to the Chickasaws in 1856. Under his supervision, the two agencies were consolidated, and the office was located here at Fort Washita. With the outbreak of war between the states, Cooper was designated by his friend Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederate, to be the Choctaw Chickasaw agent. And on June 1861, he was appointed commander of the Choctaw Chickasaw Mounted Riflemen and saw action in many hard battles. Recognition of his military ability led to him being promoted to the commander of the Indian Territory Military. And in 1865, he was appointed as the superintendent of the Indian Affairs for the District of Indian Territory. According to this particular general lived in this home, and he is buried on the grounds somewhere in an unmarked grave. So this man was the man who led this fort for a considerable amount of time up until his passing, and now he is located here on property. So when we're putting into context the history, this is one of the main players in the history of this particular fort. So it's important for us to know who these people are as we move around, because it's going to give us context as to who was directing the men, who was telling them what to do, and who was enforcing the various things. Additionally, there is this sign right here that has two historic photos when the cabin was in much worse condition. This cabin looks like it was slightly falling apart. This was in 1939. There was something that had fallen down, lots of overgrowth, and now they have made it more accessible for all of us to come out and be able to enjoy learning a little bit more about history. Okay, we're currently in the museum section of the visitor center, and it is really neat because as you go around the room, there's a timeline of events, so it puts into context a little bit more why Fort Washita was here, but also tells you a little bit more about the Indian Removal Act that we learned about outside. It talks about how the United States had originally made various treaties with various tribes, and at some point they felt as though those treaties were not honored. This is a story we've seen in a lot of places, so this is pretty familiar to the channel, but in doing so, that's what caused a lot of action to start taking place in this particular part of Oklahoma. Now, as we go around though, it's not just about that part, it's also about what happened to the fort after they decommissioned it. No one really took care of it, and that's why it kind of went into disarray, which is what we're seeing from some of the photos outside. It's important to get the context of a location, but if you for some reason cannot come into the visitor center, they've done a really good job here with explaining each one of the structures and each one of the places. But this just adds an extra layer. You can find some of the uniforms, some of the artifacts, the entire top row of drawers you can pull out, and in doing so you can see various kinds of things that they found from around here. They also have a few cases that display what the fort might have looked like in its heyday whenever it was up and thriving. And so we can learn a lot from this place. Now we made it to this final display before we exit to the other side, and this is actually the Dawes Commission in land allotment. The Dawes Act at first did not apply to many of the tribes in the Indian Territory, including the Chickasaws. And it wasn't until the Curtis Act was passed in 1898 that the allotment applied to the nation. Now, prior to the Curtis Act, members of the newly named Dawes Commission arrived in Indian Territory to meet with Chickasaws and Choctaws. By treaty, both tribes owned a common land in the Indian Territory, and the U.S. government wanted the tribes to allow allotments for individual tribe members. The Dawes Commission assignment was to convince Chickasaws and Choctaws to cede tribal titles to their land, and the Dawes Commission began conducting its land allotment work from the office in the Chickasaw capital on April 15th, 1903. Now, after the war, Fort Washita was kind of in that limbo territory because of its location. And so based on that, it was a part of the allotment process. Now, a family, Charles Colbert and his wife, ended up with this piece, and the Colberts restored the Western Barracks, and they lived in it until 1917. You're currently walking over to a different section of the fort on the old military road. Now, at one point in time, this was in such disarray that there were trees growing up. Again, the foundations were just bombarded by all of these crazy plants. You could barely see where the quarters here were. This is the bachelor's office quarters. This is the bachelor's officers quarters, and it was built in 1842 and contained approximately 12 rooms. Now, the interesting thing about this is not only did it have the 12 rooms, but it had 6 different detached kitchens. And so in the back section of this, we can see several of those kitchens just kind of lined up one after the other. We also learned that the single officers were entitled to their own private rooms. However, the junior officers would have to bunk up with a whole bunch of other people. And that would cause a lot of chaos, I'm pretty sure, because it would be overcrowded. But this is what the original structure looked like versus what it looks like now. This right here. So again, stone foundations, stone chimneys, but at the same time, they used wooden structures. They had a wraparound porch veranda area, and they had some of these dog run pass-throughs also for air and ventilation. But this is what it originally looked like, and this is all that remains today. You can see where the structure would have been set up on the foundation. Now, these are pretty decently wide when it comes to the width of the space, but at the same time, there would be individual units here, as you could see. And then in these more bulky sections, that's where the chimneys would have been for the fireplaces. And then those back structures, those are the independent freestanding kitchens. Okay, we're out and about, we're exploring, and we just went over to this cabin. This cabin was super neat. Now, each cabin that we've noticed has a different president framed on one of their older things that would have been a president that would have been important at the time. And I think it's really fascinating. But as we move around, we also notice that there's a freestanding fireplace. And when you look at the stones up close, it looks like it has some kind of like shells in it almost. You can touch it and it has a different kind of texture than just the regular rocks that we found at other places. So it leads you to wonder, where did these come from? Were these filled with fossils? Maybe, we don't know. But as we move around a little bit more, I have something really cool to share with you. We're almost to this really neat building here. But before we get there, this is the building that used to be the adjutant's office and school. It says here, with little accommodation for the children of the fort, the school generally was not available and education was left to the parents. But oftentimes, as soon as the child was able, they were assisting in daily chores and leaving them with very little idle time. Now, this is all that remains of the structure that was built in 1844. It was originally a log barracks. The building had 2 rooms, with each having a limestone fireplace that was in the central hallway area, and part of the interior was plastered. Now, sometime before 1855, the barracks were abandoned and the building became used by the adjutant's office as a schoolhouse. We happened upon this tree and it's huge, but it also has this massive crack in it, and when you look in it, it's completely and totally hollow on the inside, which is really weird. Of course, anybody who knows me here on the channel knows I am not about the sneaky snakes, and Oklahoma is known for some pretty gnarly ones. So when you come out here, because there are stone foundations, make sure that you're aware that sneaky snakes, Mr. Nope Rope, Mr. No Shoulders, they like to get on top of the rocks to sun. So be aware of that if you're crawling around on things, but also wear good shoes because there's a lot of walking going on here today. The West Barracks was built in 1856 by locally quarried limestone. The upper floors contained company quarters and orderly rooms for company sergeants. The ground floor consisted of kitchens, a mess hall, a commissary storage, and after the Civil War and the Dawes allotment, the Colbert family repaired the barracks and used it as their home until it burned in 1917. Okay, we just got out of the building that they lived in for a short time, and oh my goodness, this is so neat. This building, it doesn't quite do it justice. Just seeing it from outside, you have to go inside to see the context of the space. It's huge in there. And Dad and I have some questions. There's this big concrete circle in the ground, and we're not sure if that came along whenever they had to secure the building or if it was part of the original structure, what it could have been. It's very fascinating to see for sure. And the context from the signs do put it into perspective of how this building has been used in a variety of different ways. But we're not finished yet. Just outside of that, you have this small foundation right here. This is where the magazine used to be, which is where they would hold all of their ammunition. And then there's this huge structure in front of us, which, oh my goodness, this is wild, guys. This is one of the more interesting historic sites that I've been to that was a fort, because they do have so many structures that you can visually see through the size and expansiveness, but also the signs here are relatively new. We found out that they've been added within the last year to year and a half, and they really put a lot more context visually with the photos right outside of the structure. So definitely make sure you check out each and every sign, because they tell you what you're looking at and then also what it might have looked like, which is really, really cool. We come to this particular structure. This one's really interesting because there's a lot of story to this one. Not only can you find out about the history of it and also the original 1849 floor plan. This was the South Barracks. You can see it was a 2-story building. It had a mess hall on the bottom, and then it had barracks up top. And then you can also see how it was kind of divided up with this, but you can see it in various states of decay and disarray. Also, you can see what it looked like in its heyday. And the sad thing about this one is that at one point they had restored this building to this appearance. In fact, the reconstruction took place and was completed in 1972, but then someone came out in 2010 and burned it again. And all of this top section, of course, was made out of wood because it was along with the original plans up here. And in doing so, now you just see a shell of what is left on the bottom. So because people are bad, we now have much less to see, even despite an effort to continue updating this. You know how I always say you'll never know unless you go? This is why, because places like this are actually quite incredible. You can see how in a different time construction was made differently, how some things lasted, how other things did not, how people would be in a space and how that they would exist, and how that from that history we have a lot of different things that have happened and transpired even up to this current day. But then also, one of the other reasons I say that is because you may go to a place and then something tragic could happen, and the next time that you go there, that thing could be gone. History is one of those things that we need to learn from so that we can make better tomorrows, but we need to actually go to those places to learn from them physically in order to understand them better. Because again, you get one chance. Every day we get 24 hours. Well, as much as the good people have 24 hours, so do the people with too much time on their hands who do really terrible things. So with that, let's go look at this building that was originally constructed in 1849. You know, it's kind of a shame when you come into a place like this and it's so awesome because you get to see this amazing construction. Again, these stones were quarried locally. They were put together with this binding cement. And in the stone foundations, you'll see that that is still present. They lasted a long time when they used those kind of materials. And then we learned that everything that wasn't that no longer is here. So that's another thing we could take away from sites like this. But wow, it's huge. This building was another large 2-story building. You can see the 2 fireplaces right here, and they're on both sides. So it was a way for them to keep warm, and that was the sole source of warmth. They didn't have heating and air like we do today, and so this is how it worked. They had thick walls that were strong, thick walls, and then they had natural heat from the fireplace, like they've done it since the beginning of time. We are now standing at what remains of the commissary. The commissary used to look like this building right here. Again, a wooden structure on top, but they had these tunnels that would go underground, and they had underground rooms here. Now, the underground rooms were 28 feet by 80 feet in size, and they could hold 3,000 5-gallon barrels in these underground rooms. The commissary was used for all the supplies for all of the military men and then also the officers. And then this top part was more of a storefront. And what they would use that for was for various things. They also had potentially the post quartermaster living in this building. Now, all that remains, these entryways toward what was the underground structure. Now, because again, it is Oklahoma and it's that time of year where we're starting to get into the warmth, we're not going in here because these leaves are prime ground for rattlesnakes. However, you can see the walls here are substantial in height. They're about 4.5 to 5 feet tall. And then this goes on and around and all the way back toward the blacksmith area over here. This is a very long structure, and it has not only this entrance, but also another one that is matched to it on the opposite side over here. And then this area would have kept everything cooler because not only was it partially underground, but it also had these thick walls of protection. Looks like Dad has made his way down here, so we're gonna go try to catch up with him and find out what he's looking at right now. This is a place that you're gonna wanna allocate a few hours to explore, because even though you can drive to some of the sites, walking to them is also something you're going to be doing. And so we've been out here for a bit. It's a nice day though, so it's perfect. Got down to where Dad was. This is the old hospital, and again, just a foundation, but Dad and I were kind of speculating that this looks like a solid foundation. However, they do have these post portions that are very similar to what we've been finding in other sections. So we're wondering if the hospital was larger than just this little postage stamp right here. Now out back, there's another kitchen over here, and Dad's going to explore that. As we're walking up, we saw this. This is the guardhouse, and even though this is not the entrance now, the entrance now is just a few feet over in that direction. This could have been the original place where you enter, and they might have had people stationed here in the entry area. Now again, this was a very volatile time in history where they were doing the Indian removals, and so it would have been important to have someone standing guard of the fort at all times to make sure that nothing nefarious was going on around it, but also to make sure that whatever was happening was conveyed to the commanding officers immediately. Now as we move closer to the blacksmith shop, we also are passing a bake oven, and this kind of gives you context as to how the fireplaces might have been used. It has a little door on it. It has an entire fireplace here, and it's built into this huge rock structure. And so this could have been how that they would use their ovens in their kitchen also, very similarly. So this is pretty neat to have this kind of context where it's been restored a little bit more so that we can see it. But Dad is off in this direction, so we're gonna go catch up with him. He said sometimes they do demonstrations here. I'm not sure if they're doing anything today, but during their special events, this building right over here is where the action's at. Now the blacksmith shop was a key in any community or any military installation. The reason why is because they could do a variety of different tasks. They could work on all sorts of different things that were necessary. They could even shoot the horses. So you needed a blacksmith in order to have the basic things. And so the blacksmith shop here is pretty neat because they have some of the tools, and again, sometimes they do demos and things like that. But another cool thing inside this little building right here was the fact that they had a small post office post, and that was pretty neat to see as well. So really cool stop. Definitely check this out if you come here. But now we have some difficult decisions. Dad and I have to figure out where we're going next. The interesting thing is the blacksmith shop that you see currently is a recreation. However, they do have the foundation for the original blacksmith shop right behind that. Currently walking through what used to be the stables. And at the end of the stables, there's another sign So we're trying to figure out exactly what that is. Now, as we're walking around, there's lots of options, paths that you can take. And there's also a lot of places that you can sit down along the way. So take your time, enjoy yourself. Well, look at this. It's expansive out here. So much history, so much history. However, we did also learn that even though they do have sometimes whenever you can come out here and dig with permission, you're not supposed to keep anything out here. So don't bring a metal detector or anything crazy like that. This isn't that kind of place. Out here toward this sign, this is the saddle room, and it's built up a little bit from the remaining area out here. And you can see the stones around the foundation, but also there's a pretty sizable step in this direction. So this is where that would have sat. So this would have been the saddle room, tack room area. And then all of this is where the stables would have been. And then Dad has just found even more rocks that are lined out in this section. So I wonder, because there's another sign up here, if this was also where the barn was maybe, or another barracks for those who were the dragoons who would have to take care of their horses maybe. Let's find out. Let's go over here. That's looking on the map again. And what all does it have, Dad?
Got corral, water trough, stable guard, saddle and feed room, stable, sergeant's quarters, and entrance.
Okay, so all of that would have been located in this one section here. So this giant conglomerate area, and this backs up to where we have trees, and then over in this direction there's just like a large area that's kind of blank between where we found the stables up here and then this area kind of toward this section of the property. Now Dad is walking in the direction of the road that runs through here, and as we move closer to that, again, you can see there's a lot of things going on along here in way of signs. Along the way also, we've been finding these stacks of wood, and they're actually preparing for a huge event. They host a huge rendezvous here. And I've been to a Mountain Man rendezvous once before, where they have all sorts of people who would show you how they would make beadwork, or how they would have furs and trade and all sorts of interesting, unique things. But this is a little bit different because it's sectioned out in the middle of the fort. So they have camping all through this section. So it's pretty neat. So if you're ever looking for a rendezvous to go to, this might be the one for you. Okay, we came to the end of the path that we were on, and it leads you to a Confederate cemetery. Now there's not a lot of marked graves here. There are a lot of unmarked graves. So you just kind of come in here and you can look around, but you need to be reverent, because even if at any point in time, historically, you have agreed or disagreed with either side, it is still a cemetery, and we pay our respects to those who are passed away and here. So this is a good way to have context for the time, and also to kind of realize that there aren't a lot of markings here. So a lot of people were never identified, and that's a pretty big deal also. So again, come here or don't, but be respectful and be reverent whenever you do come, because it's important that we are kind, because ultimately we don't know circumstances, we don't know situations, and we don't know people, and because of that we just come here for an educational standpoint. That lay in front of us is the laundry, and we just learned that this building was built approximately in 1842, and it was first a barracks and then turned into a laundress quarters. Now the laundress was a person who was essential to the entire operation of the fort, because they would make sure that everything was maintained, from buttons being stitched back on to the cleanliness of the uniforms. Now an officer might have had to pay more for his clothes than an enlisted man. Usually it was between $2 and $5 for any kind of officer, and only 75 cents for enlisted men. However, this has a little bit more depth to it. Now, did you know that at the time they didn't have any kind of like family allowance for the officers or for those who were enlisted who might have had a wife or a child? They just didn't. So a lot of times the wives would take one of these jobs, and it wouldn't be a very high paying job, but it would sometimes be a little bit better than some of the enlisted men. But then they would take side jobs in addition to that to help out and to help support their families. And so this is just kind of an interesting quarters, and it's just right outside this big barracks that we went through earlier. Okay, it was only like a literal minute drive to get over here, and oh my goodness, this is so cool. Dad had mentioned that there was something pretty neat that he thought I would like over here. He was correct. This is really, really neat. There's a parking place right here that you can see that you can pull into, but right in front of this parking area there is a southern route of 49ers to California map, and it has a whole bunch of different headlines and stories and quotes from the time of those who were coming across Oklahoma and through the Indian Territory at the time and going to seek out fame and fortune over in California digging for gold. So we're gonna check this out. And then on the opposite side, there's a vehicle at which they might have used for this process. Now, along all of these stories, there's some really neat ones. There's some quotes in here from different newspapers and articles. This one is interesting because it talks about the 3 major routes that go out of the Fort Smith area. And you can see those routes right here. One of them drops down and takes the southern path through Fort Washita. And if you keep going in this direction, you go all the way over to Phoenix on this southern route. This one right here, as they're moving through the Panhandle and into New Mexico, says that they average between 6 and 12 miles a day in the Indian Territory, but once they got into the open plains, it was not uncommon for them to move 28 miles a day. The desert and the mountain regions slowed down the traffic to 5 to 10 miles a day. Just past the timeline of the 49ers, we get to this monument right here, and this is the Chickasaw Trail of Tears. Of course, the Indian Removal Act is known also as the Trail of Tears in many areas, and there were many paths that came across the United States for which different groups would be relocating to the Oklahoma Territory. And here we see that during the late 1830s and early 1840s, Chickasaw Indians removed by the United States government from Mississippi and Alabama passed near here on their way to their new homeland. And so this is a monument to honor those people and that really arduous task of getting from point A to point B. This was a horrible, gruesome walk. They were not doing this in a way that they were excited about. They were being literally taken from one place and put into another place. So it's important that we remember things like this, especially when we're at a place that was so pivotal in this removal process. History is not always pretty, and it's important for us to look at the ugly side of history as well as the glamorous part of history. A lot of times people see the movies and they think that they have all of the concepts of what's actually happened, when in all reality, they couldn't be further from the truth. I've gone to many stops along the Trail of Tears, and I've learned about the various indigenous groups that came across those areas. It was a tiring process that the elderly many times did not make. It was hard for the children, the livestock, and they were only able to take with them what they could physically carry, which a lot of people think, oh, well, a lot of people were nomadic, and so they were constantly in motion, so they were used to that, but that wasn't always the case. And so as we come to places like this where we have signs to talk a little bit more about that, it is nice to see how the settlers came and used this area and their quotes and how they made it to California. However, it's also important to realize that that came at a very big cost for us to have that expansion westward, and it was at the cost of these people. And so it's very important for us to come to these areas and learn that lesson and to take that with us and to educate others about that. And that's why I do these things here on the channel. But with that said, let's go look at a couple of other places and we'll wrap up today's video. Okay guys, so we're at one of our last stops here, and we originally went again in this direction and then kind of off that way, and that's where the Confederate Cemetery was. However, they have a second cemetery here on the property, and this one has a pretty interesting historic sign at the back. So we're gonna make our way through here again with respect, with reverence, and we're gonna find out exactly what this cemetery is, because there's no markers at the front, but there's definitely a big one at the back. As we're going through this section, the large stone mentions that this section back here toward the rear of the cemetery is for the original family. The family that we mentioned that had converted the barracks and lived there, this was their plot of land. They were given this plot whenever the allotments were made for the nations. And this particular plot then became their family cemetery area. So this is in honor of their family. Now, I'm not sure exactly about the remaining graves in this area because they have different names, and there are quite a lot of them. Some of them are quite old. There's a Woodsman of America over here, and there's a few other stones that have clearly stood for quite some years. In the opposite cemetery, we did find this one, which is General W.M. Belknap, and he died November 10th, 1851, and is enshrined here. And then this also we found out is called the Post Cemetery. Now I know you're probably saying, Bunny, why are you roaming around a cemetery and why do we care? Because I think it's interesting to see how this particular space has meant so many different things to so many different people. And so by coming here, we get to find out what those things are and how that they are memorialized here as well, because it was an important place to them. Now, as we're exploring the cemetery, we noticed that there was a structure off to the side of it, and we were trying to figure out what it was because there's no sign here. The sign is currently down. It does have a step up into it, and then it has this huge foundation again where there's lots and lots of what looked to be rooms that were supported. We looked it up on the little map on the QR code, and this is actually a secondary hospital. This was a much larger hospital, so we're assuming this was the bigger place that people would come to. This also had an underground storage, a morgue, and several other facilities within it. So this would have been much larger than the initial site, which was up toward the front gate area. But you can see that you can distinguish individual rooms by the foundation of the size, and then also some of them you can see where it might have had a support door even. Pretty fascinating stuff, definitely. And this would make sense being located right next to the cemetery if this is where they would transport people directly to the post cemetery. Here we have 4 unknown graves. They have marked these off because they're away from the other cemetery. Just beyond that, we have another kitchen structure and then also another quarters for officers. And again, the foundations are here. These buildings probably were very similar to the one that we initially saw at the front, where we talked about the main players in this particular engagement. And if you look on beyond that, that's the visitor center right up there. Now we came over to this other section where we only had the 2 stones, and when we came in we saw that this one is actually the marked section for the Chickasaw Indian Burial Grounds, and it says here that it was dedicated in 1966. This right here is a big expansive space, and as you can see, Dad is walking over to this section. There's not anything really marked. I'm gonna see if on the other side of this, if it mentions anything, but this could be an other unknown grave area. It looks as though it is. And so we don't have context for who might be buried here. And because of that, it makes it a little bit more sad. See, unlike the military who engaged and chose to come to a place like this for the removal of the Indians didn't choose to be removed. And because of that, when we come to places like this, we know that horrific things happened, even if you're just looking at it from the relocation standpoint. It wasn't pretty. And so coming to a place like this, we honor this open space as a place of remembrance for those who had to come through as a part of the Trail of Tears, for those who had to endure any kind of suffering as a result of broken treaties. But we come here and we also realize that this is a place that has been reclaimed by the people. This belongs to the very people who were basically told that they needed to get up and go. And there's something really cathartic to that. Thank you again for coming along with me on this digital field trip. I have had a wonderful time sharing Fort Washita with you. I hope that you have enjoyed coming along and getting some brain wrinkles. Remember, if you want to keep history alive at places like this, they do accept donations, and you can always come out and purchase something from the gift shop. Otherwise, this was a completely and totally free location for us to get some brain wrinkles, and I'm so glad that you guys came along with me. For now though, I'm gonna go on a little bit of a walk, and I'll be seeing you guys next time. Remember, we're not here for a long time, but we are here for a good time. Bye.